Hello and welcome to my channel. This is an absolutely classic 19th century style Bowie knife. For those who are interested, it's the Marto M-A-R-T-O N14000, and I like it because it's completely plain and unadorned. That beechwood handle could be on a trowel. This carbon steel knife has the absolutely classic 19th century style brass S-shaped guard. I've seen that somewhere before. This is a facon. It's the knife of the South American equivalent of the American cowboy, the gaucho. If the gaucho is the equivalent of the American cowboy, then the facon is the equivalent of the Bowie knife, I guess we could say. It's far more ornate than the Bowie. There are 11 elements to this handle alone. And check out the spine. So, Latin American cowboys prefer more ornamentation and less weight. This is a very fast flicky blade. It's got loads of distal taper. It's a genuine one, made in Entre Rios in Argentina, and it has quite a lot of distal taper. That really shows when you hold it. And this is a knife given to me by a friend. He found it in a quarry. Can you see where I'm going with this? This facon is made of carbon steel. In a previous life it was a ploughshare disc. Well, I can see that this is proper steel and not stainless. The blade shape's not that different. What would it take to turn this into something approaching a facon? I think the first step would be to remove the side scales. Okay, with the side scales removed, we can see that the tang's just as rusted as the blade. The way this facon was made was that somebody welded a length of 8mm stud bar to the end of the blade, so I should really cut off my full tang. But for reasons of strength, I'm going to leave a stub. My plan then is to cut a slot in one end of a piece of stud bar and slide it over here when I weld it. It should give me a bit of extra strength. So there's the slit, and that fits onto here. Before I weld it on there though, I think it would be easier to get the rust off now, so let's do that first. This is the state the blade was in when we found it, and this is it after 5 minutes on a pillar drill with a rotary wire brush. I don't think I want to get it much cleaner than that. I'm not trying to make something that looks brand new. I've realised that before I can weld on my bit of threaded bar, I need to slide on the guard, because it won't slide over the threaded bar afterwards. So this is the beginnings of it. This is just a piece of galvanised mild steel, and to get the galv off, I'm not going to grind it off because it will leave horrible marks. I'm going to try something that I discovered myself. This is the juice of 2 small lemons. I'll stick that in there, and in 24 hours there'll be no galv left on it at all. And after 24 hours we can see that the surface above the piece of steel is covered in bubbles. And the zinc's gone. So the guard and the tang should go on there something like this. The next job is to shape the guard. That looks a bit better. I deliberately didn't look at the real facon while I made this guard, but I did compare it afterwards, and I have made mine a little more bendy than the original. My next job's to weld on the tang, having of course remembered to slide the guard into position first. It's welded on reasonably well, however the guard suffered more than I would have liked. That was all nice and shiny. I'm going to have to sort that out. I'll tell you what we should do. Seeing as we have one here, let's just check in with the real deal. Okay, that looks reasonable. My blade's shorter and broader, but I've got enough stud bar there. And the guard isn't too different despite being made from a different metal. Handle material options. We have here a hardwood called sapelli. That's a nice bit of English oak, This is wild olive, and here we have some deer antler. As the antler is rather skinny, it's going to have to go down near the base by the guard and then swell out. The noble stag has yielded this thing, which should hopefully go there. I'll probably put another piece up near the end somewhere as well, so I may as well cut a thin slice now. The real cuchillo criollo has a layer of a contrasting metal, usually brass, separating the different elements that go together to make up the handle. So I needed to get hold of some brass, and it occurred to me that what we in England call taps, faucets in the US, are often made of brass. So I chopped one up, and it's true. These don't yield big enough bits of brass to have made the guard, for example, but I can get a couple of little washers out of this to separate the layers of wood and other material. I've abandoned the idea of using the English oak. So that's antler, sapelli, olive, antler again. After some further fiddling, I've made two more decisions. The first is to get rid of this piece of antler. It's too small, and it would force the shape of the handle to become very strange. The second is to use little leather inserts. This is great because it gives you a tiny amount of elasticity, so that when you come to do up this homemade nut on the top, it will be correctly lined up. Well, there's no turning back now. I've made all my decisions and glued it up. I hope I've left enough meat on this side to give me a decent swell. I took an angle grinder to it, and I've got this far so far. There's some nasty cracks where the leather's missing, like that. I have to see what I can do about those, and I need to cut the tip off and finish forming the pommel. There. Now I can round the whole thing into one shape. I've had it on the belt sander. What I did was glue bits of leather into the worst of those cracks where the stuff was missing. I need to do a couple more actually. But yeah, the general shape is starting to come out. I didn't really plan this shape, it just happened. I did find that I had made a hole. An ill-advised attempt to drill through had burst out here, so I cut a chunk from this piece of the same wood and used it to plug it. Having rubbed the handle down with progressively finer and finer sandpaper, I'm ready to move on to the final treatment, which will be a coating of wax. My neighbour gave me this stuff, and he said to warm it gently before applying it. I'll do that off camera and show you the results. Well, I used about half of what the guy gave me, and this is the result. You definitely notice the grain more. It's darkened the whiter bits and darkened the leather unevenly, strangely. But now I need to buff it. At the moment it's still too sticky. The strange thing is, I set out to make a South American style knife, and this reminds me more of the sort of thing a Canadian or North USA mountain man might have wielded in the 19th century. It doesn't seem at all South American to me anymore, even with that guard. Let's make a sheath for it. These three pieces of leather will form the basis for it. This one's the thickest at about 2.7 millimeters. The others are just over 2 millimeters thick. The purpose of this bit is so that the blade doesn't rub against the stitching as it goes in and out. It's a spacer, effectively. In order to stitch all 3 layers together, I need to make holes which are perfectly aligned and go through all 3 pieces at once. To achieve this, some years ago, I made this thing. It did my first few sheaths, but since then I've bought these, and on the straights you can fairly zoom along with this one. I've got a leftover piece of leather which I cut away in order to create this bit. I can now make use of that to make the strap, which will go on the back of here to take the wearer's belt. And of course I need to sew my belt strap on before I sew this on, or I won't be able to. I started experimenting with some leather dye. I found some in the cupboard. It said brown. I used it, and then after using it saw in my own handwriting on the box, comes out black. So this is too dark really. I'm glad I tried it on the back, and I've also tried it here. This is going to show, so I suppose this will have to be the final colour now. I wanted a lighter colour, but never mind. I've tacked this in position, as well as this, with super glue, because it makes it easier to stitch them without having them sliding around all over the place. Before I go too much further, I should decide what I'm going to do about holding the knife in the sheath. I can either have a diagonal one that comes over here, I can have a low strap here, or a high one here. They each have their own advantages and disadvantages. With this sewn firmly in place, I was able to turn the sheath over and sew on this front bit. Sadly it's a bit too short, I'm going to have to do something about that. And I also sewed on this thing. I don't want this sheath to have any modern accoutrements, the sort of little rivets and press studs that you buy on Amazon. I want this sheath to look as though it was made before those things were available. So I'm going to close the fastening with a button, which I propose to make from antler. I'll trim a piece from the end of this chunk and try and turn it into a little flat disc with 4 holes in. Okay, let's drill some holes in it. Here then is my antler button. That middle spongy bit, I was worried that it would be too soft, so I've drenched it in super glue, sanded away all evidence of having done so, but it's certainly stiffened up the centre of the thing. As for this, the idea, the reason why I've put it here, is that it should go round this skinny bit, and by fitting snugly, if I get it right, prevent the knife both from falling out of the sheath and from doing that annoying thing that knives with heavy handles do, which is flopping out away from the sheath all the time. I've trimmed the edges neatly. I need to do the same up here, and then it'll be time to finish dyeing the whole sheath. The whole sheath's dyed now. The bit that was suede has an interesting texture to it. I almost wish I'd used that on the front. But here it is with the button sewn in place. And now for the matter of sharpening. We're going to be using this simple Amazon knife sharpening jig. This implement is brand new, it's the first time it's ever been used. The stone seems incredibly soft. I think by the time this knife's sharp, I'll have worn a couple of them out. So I'm sure you don't want to sit through hours of this. Let's fast forward a little at least. 10 minutes later, and it really does look as though this thing works. excuse my technique, I've never used one of these before. There are things to think about. Certain angles tend to encourage you to twist in undesirable ways. I've noticed that I need to watch out for that. I've already started wondering if I can cut down a file and fit it into these glued jaws. Let's remove the knife and compare the two sides. You can clearly see the results I've been getting on this side compared to this. This doesn't have that bright edge. Well, this edge is utterly terrific now. There's no doubt that the jig makes for much more effective sharpening than I at least can manage by hand. Well, I set out to make one sort of knife and ended up making something very, very different. But I'm glad you came along. Thanks for watching.